everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Follow-Up. My name is Nathan Lynn. I'm the technical director here on staff at Calvary, and I'm joined by James Teutschmann. Hello, James.
Hello, good friend.
How are you doing?
I'm great today.
Good.
Doing
I'm
great.
Doing good too. As you guys can probably tell, neither of us are Scott Beckenhauer.
Not tall enough.
Not tall enough, not handsome enough, not any of those adjectives that we might use. Scott's actually a little busy this week, and so we gave him the opportunity to kind of head out, but we wanted to make sure that we still took the chance to unpack the sermon that we heard yesterday, right? That we still sat down and we still walked through this with you guys. And so we have been in this series. It was the last week of this series that we have called All the Time, right? It's based around that story where Jesus is approached by the religious leaders of his time, and they're basically trying to trap him
into a
and they say, Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? Hoping that he says one thing and they can frame it to look like he missed something else or whatever. And he kind of turns the tables on them, and he responds by telling them the most important thing is that they love God with all that they are, all the time, right? And so over the course of this series that we've been doing for the past few weeks, we've unpacked what it looks like to actually love God with all your heart, with all your mind, and then the last week we just had with all your strength. And it was a really, really great sermon, right? It was a little bit different.
It was a little different. And this whole series, I've really enjoyed it because a lot of it, it's easy to say like love God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and just kind of like leave it at that. But then when you start to be like, well, what does this actually mean? Like that's just kind of like a phrase that people use. I don't really know what it means. But we had a guest yesterday. His name was Gus, and he has
Ron
a pretty
Gustafson.
Yeah,
and it goes by Gus.
And it just goes by Gus. I don't know. Maybe he hates the word Ron. I should have asked him. I had lunch with him yesterday. I should have asked. But he kind of has had some pretty unique life experiences to help speak into what it's like to love God with all of your strength. So now he's like a motivational speaker. But before that, when he was 9 years old, he was in a kind of a freak farming accident, and he lost his right arm, and then he said the tractor kind of like ran over his leg, crushed his leg as well.
Just a horrible situation.
Yeah, and so when we talk about like loving God with all your strength, like if we only think about it physically, then it becomes very problematic very quickly.
Yeah, we're asking half a question almost at what this answer could be. Is so much more to unpack, and it was a really, really great moment. Scott got to interview Gus for quite a while, and it was a beautiful, beautiful sermon and beautiful story that we got to hear. So if you haven't heard it, it's available on our website, Calvary.ch. It's also available on YouTube. Make sure you check the sermon out.
Don't listen to us. Go check it out.
Go check it out. You can also, if you're interested, you can check out Ron's website, fullyarmed.com, which is obviously poking a bit of fun at his life, which I think is really great. He had a great sense of humor. I got to talk to him quite a bit before the service.
And he posted during the sermon, he posted a picture of him in his hotel room, and he was sitting in this chair in the hotel room, and it had only an armrest on the right side, and he only has a left arm. And so he's like, sometimes I just feel like this world isn't built for me. He's got a great. He's a hilarious guy.
When he came in, we were setting up the sermon, and I was asking if he wants to sit on one side or the other, how he was with his mic, just normal questions you'd ask anyone coming in. He said, "Well, I think it's important I probably sit over here. I'm left-handed, so this is going to be easier for me." And I thought, that's a good one, Ron. That's a good one there. Yeah. So he's a funny guy, but he just had an incredible story and a really, really interesting way to be able to convey, I think, that message. What does it look like to love God with all my strength? And like you said, you phrased it really well, James. If we just talk about our physical strength or something physically when it comes to that, we're missing a massive portion of
because then it becomes like, well, if I'm not physically strong or if I'm not physically able to do some things, then that means I can love God less, which is not anything that like the passage is trying to get across. But yesterday, Gus he kind of said this phrase. He said, we all have challenges that we're faced with, but we can keep the perspective that God's in control. And so it's kind of like we're all faced with things, and it might look different, the different obstacles and things that come in our life. But when those things happen, it's about having like loving God with all of our strength is like kind of taking the mindset that happens with it and kind of putting it into perspective of what's going on. And I think that's what's mirrored in like the whole story of Job. And like I can think of a couple different stories in the Bible that all of it is like mirrored on loving God. Like this is what it looks like to love God with all of your strength as well.
We even talk like that when it comes to the way that people are experiencing hardships in their life, right? Whether we're talking about Gus yesterday and some of the hard things that have happened in his life, he had a lot more stories that were really, really heart-wrenching. But one of the way we talk about people like that in those moments is we'll say, man, you're so strong for going through that. And it's not this physical strength. It's this emotional, spiritual strength that we're telling these people that it takes a lot of strength for you to be doing and accomplishing what you're going through right now and be moving through that. And so that's what we're talking about. And one of the verses they kind of circled themselves around for the sermon was a little known verse maybe for some of you guys.
Oh yeah,
Philippians 4:13, right? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Right?
Written on every Christian Sports Athletic Association
maybe
website.
One of the most famous verses of all time, just casually. But it's a really, really important verse that doesn't take away from what it actually means. I can can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And again, man, I since you said that, James, like it hasn't left my mind. We're not just talking about a physical strength here, because that is missing such a massive part of what even this verse, or what Gus's story, or what Jesus is talking about at the beginning by loving God with all your strength. That's missing such a massive part of what that even means.
Yeah,
right?
and Gus even unpacked this verse a little bit for us, and the I can do all things. He said this part's probably the most that's taken out of context, is we're like, well, I can do all things, so insert whatever you want to do.
Anything I want to do.
Anything I want to do with strength.
Yep, write this down.
But he said like the idea of I can do all things. It's really probably a better translation would be like I can go through all things through Christ who strengthens me.
I can endure
and
all
I can
things.
endure all things through Christ who strengthens me. When you start to put that type of language into it, then it really helps shift the perspective of, okay, it's not about what I can do, but it's about what Christ is helping me do. And so that when we think of like, I can do all things, it's like, I have the power to do this. But when you think of I can go through all things, or I can endure all things, it's because of what Christ has done, I can make it through.
Yeah.
And it's not that we're just trying to live this life and just make it through, but it's like there are times that you're going to have seasons of different challenges. Like the Bible tells us that things come and go in seasons. And so you're going to have like times where it's really difficult to maybe like for a few months or maybe a few years, you can go through like spiritual like wildernesses, and you kind of just feel like we ask these questions when things are going wrong of like, well, where's God in this? Where can I see God? And we talked about this a little earlier. I think it's a lot like, it's like when you have a cold, when you're sick, and maybe you like your throat's sore. I think about a lot when like if I get like strep throat, my throat's sore, you're like, I don't remember what it's like to not
even remember not having a cold.
Yeah.
I can't remember being able to breathe through both my nostrils or swallow without it hurting.
And I always think of like, as soon as this comes, I'm never going to take it for granted. I'm never going to take my ability to breathe perfectly for granted.
Thank God every day for 2 nostrils.
And then the sickness goes away, and I don't think about it.
I've never thought about it a single time until I get sick again. I think, oh, if only I could breathe.
Woe is me.
Yeah,
like, where is God in this?
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a little bit kind of how we feel also spiritually. Like we don't, like sometimes we don't think about God like playing a role until something goes bad. And then we're like, okay, God, I need you to show up now.
That's good.
When we really need God to show up all the time. Yeah. And so again, it's that perspective, but that's like the age old question. It's like, does God know what it's like to be human? Does God understand my struggle? Is he here with me?
Is God present in my hardships? That's like the big question, right? And it almost always circles back around to the question of why does God let bad things happen? That's the question that so many ask, right? And that is almost the number one dart that gets thrown at the board, right? When people are talking about this kind of thing, is why do bad things happen? Then why does a good God allow these things to happen? And you and I, again, jokingly talked about this earlier. I don't think 2 young 20-something men are going to be able to answer that question to everyone's satisfaction. Yeah. But we did kind of say what is interesting is that's almost the wrong question to be asking. That's not the question that I think needs to be asked in that moment, right? And it's nice because Gus made a good point of this. He said it a couple times in his interview, in his sermon, but he said, we're all facing challenges, right? Every single person in this room is facing a challenge. He even made a point to say, if you don't have anything going on right now that you're struggling with, raise your hand. No one raised their hand, not a single person in the room, right? Because everyone in that moment is applying it to their own challenges. And so when they're in that moment, we find ourselves asking, where is God in this? Like, why is God allowing these things to happen? And you kind of said that earlier, James, and when we were talking about this, you almost said, that's not the question that we should be asking. You want to unpack that really quickly?
Yeah. So when we look at like the storyline of the Bible, like really simply, it's that God was in community with us in creation. And because of like our actions, we kind of like separated those two things. And ever since then, the story of the Bible is how do we put heaven and earth back together? And that's what Jesus came to do. And with his life, death, and resurrection, it's beginning to overlap. That's why we see Jesus healing people and feeding people. You're starting to see heaven and earth come together. And Jesus was really heaven on earth. And so our role as the church is to begin to help push that together even further. And one day it will be like fully restored. So that's the story of the Bible. When I think of it through that lens of like, why does God let bad things happen? I was like, that's not that's not how the story unfolded. And so to kind of put that weight on God and that decision on God, like that's just like not how the story even unfolds. That's not the story the Bible's trying to tell.
That's so cool. That's a really good way to say that too. The way you phrase that is that's not even how it happened. Like the question of why does God let things happen? That's not what we're talking about. We've missed it from the go, right? The world is in this constant state of being pulled apart from God, right? And like you said, the whole story of the Bible, the story of redemption, the redemption arc that takes place from 1 to whatever the last page might be. That is this coming together is heaven on earth, right? And the heaven on earth we see portrayed in the New Testament through Jesus, in the later books through the acts of his apostles and his teaching, and the churches that come all the way to now through the churches now is that redemption, is that coming together.
Yeah, and that's literally the role of like planting churches. That's why we do that, is because it's like we're being a part of the new creation. That's why like we were like, well, we have this church here. Why should we care if there's another one somewhere else? It's like, well, if we believe that we're supposed to be restoring our community both spiritually and physically, then we want to help create those everywhere else. And so that's what it looks like for us to, like, as people that live here in the Omaha metro area in 2021, that's what it looks like for us to love God with all of our strength and to help each other endure all things through Christ.
That's great.
And like as the church, we get to encourage each other, we get to equip each other, empower each other to live this life of showing other people and inviting them into what it's like to be a part of God's family.
That's good.
And so that's what I get excited about. That's why like I love doing like outreach things. It's just like it's like the tangibleness of making that happen, of like helping people to see that God loves them, God's for you. And I think that's one thing that Gus in having conversations with them after is I think people need to know that God is for you. Like God is.
And if someone like Gus who can very obviously see has had a hard life, this man has every reason to be upset about the lot he's been given, his leg, his arm. He talked about having some sickness in his body later on in life that has just started to tear away at him. And you can think like, man, if that guy can realize that he has the strength to endure all those things through Christ and that God is for him in that, some of us, and that was even a question. Scott sent out some questions to a few of the staff members before the sermon was finalized. And he said, is there something you would ask? And that was actually the question that I put. I said, well, how would someone like Gus, who's had a hard life, no one could deny, how does he take that and then in turn explain that and make that a teaching point, a learning point for other people whose hardships are different, not lesser, not greater, but different somewhere else. And I think he nailed that. I think the way you just phrased that nailed that God is with you through these things.
Yeah, and I think it's just really powerful when you think of that, because I think we both personally know people that have gone through things and they've felt like God wasn't there for them or because of this, that then they begin to walk away, and that's like really it's hard. It's like hard to watch, like really, because it's just like it's like missing the point.
I think you're missing the point.
I think you're missing the point.
It's hard to be in that moment.
Yeah, and it's also like in those moments, like we should probably encourage and probably like be a lot more like caring into those things. But I don't know, every situation like is going to be like a little different. But it's really cool to hear someone like Gus, who's like kind of gone through these things and be like, no, here's the perspective. Like I can endure all things through Christ who strengthens me, and this is what it means. This is what it looks like for me, and this is how I'm. And he's like living a life that's encouraging other people. He talks. He's talked to I think every prison in Nebraska.
Wow.
And he's like gone and done a bunch of different things. He talks at a lot of schools and stuff, but kind of just like encouraging people to fight whatever their battle looks like, whether it's addiction, physical ailments, mental things, like you name it. He's like encouraging people to endure all things because of Christ. Yeah. And so pointing other people into that and pointing them back to that creation story and the redemption and the healing and the like that, all the things that come from that is
that he has promised,
that God promises us.
That's great. And that actually really rolls us into to kind of wrapping this up. Everyone, when they come to the follow-up, we promise them that they're going to get a couple of things. And one of those is we want to talk about how do we take this and we put it into action, right? What does it mean to love God with all of our strength, right? Yeah. And what do you think that means?
So I really do think, like, even though this is probably the most quoted verse of all time and the most out of context verse of all time, I think it really, a lot of it is having the right perspective. How do we consistently, and I think the Bible really points to this theme of we are a forgetful people. We forget what it's like. We forget how God has provided for us. So when we end up in a desert somewhere, we're like, God's not here. Like, where am I? And so I think some of it is remembering what God has done for us so that we can have the right perspective of like when we are in times of trouble. And so like this verse says, like enduring all things through Christ, it has there's really not a lot of the weight that's on us. It's Christ in the Spirit empowering you.
That's great.
And so instead of feeling like you have to push through, I have to grind through this, or like that hustle mentality, whatever, like instead of me trying to do this, it's actually openly receiving what the Spirit can do for you and how the Holy Spirit can empower you.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what it really looks like to love God with all of your strength. It's less of me and more of like finding the healing and the power through the Holy Spirit.
That's great. And I would echo that. I think that the way we talked about at the beginning is kind of the way I've shaped it from there, is that what it means to love God with all our strength means not the physical strength, not anything that we can literally do, but it means to be strong in those moments, right? To choose in the hardships and in the great moments as well, when sometimes it's like you said, it's easy to forget God when everything's going great, but in those moments to have the strength, like we talk about someone else when they're going through hardships, you're so strong to continue to have that strength.
Yeah.
That is showing your love. That is giving God the worship, the praise, the love that he is worthy of. That is giving him the recognition. That's loving God with all your strength. When it's hard, when it's not hard, whatever it is, being in that moment, living that's their strength. That's moving forward with God. And I think that's awesome. And so that was the kind of the wrap up to our series all the time, right? It was really cool, kind of short series, but I thought it was great to unpack that segment, right? Because it's an interesting story. It's an interesting way to phrase those three answers. And I think that we were very lucky to have Scott and Ryan be able to unpack those for us. And so looking ahead at kind of what the next couple of weeks look like, next week we have a Impact Sunday for us, right? It's going to be a really awesome Sunday. James, I think you're going to be a big part of it. So tell us a little bit about what next week looks like.
I get the chance to speak this Sunday. I'm super excited about it, but we're going to be kind of talking about church planning and kind of how we've been making an impact through church planning. And this is not going to be a Calvary pat yourself on the back Sunday. There's gonna be a lot of like cool topics. We kind of maybe brushed a little bit about kind of what we're going to be talking about, but a little bit is more of the like this is why we do what we do. This is like why. So basically, I guess if you want to know what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about like what is the church supposed to do and why are we here?
Yeah,
that's really like
that's awesome.
At the foundation of like what it's all about. And so it's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm super excited. So that's where we're headed.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm really, really excited. I think it would not be, we would never blame anyone if they didn't have the best idea of exactly what goes on here at Calvary, the outreach that we have. It's hard to keep up with all that, but I think it's going to really, really excite some people to kind of see what Calvary's been doing. And like you said, what the church is supposed to be doing. This is why we're here and this is what we're going to do about it. I think that's awesome. So guys, thank you very much for joining us for this week's follow-up. Make sure you check it. The sermon, like we said, is available on Calvary.ch, also on our YouTube if you haven't seen it. And if not, we'll see you next week for our Sunday morning services.